We are back for another episode of the Ruling on the Field podcast. I'm Seth Mendelson, and with me is my brother, Sam Mendelson. And Sam, we're getting right into it. Monday Night Football. We had a Super Bowl rematch, a Kelsey Bowl, Season Bowl, if you will. A game that a lot of people had a lot of hype for. The weather, Mother Nature didn't really come into play, kind of stomped on that parade. It ended up being a pretty close game, a pretty fun game at the end of it, but maybe not the game that people were expecting. And I know we have a lot of football to talk about, a lot of stories, a lot of headlines, but let's start with this game. Eagles, Chiefs. You know, we get Jason Kelce winning his first game against his younger brother, Travis Kelce. That'd be like you beating me for the first time, which rarely happens. But let's jump right in because this was, you know, for all intents and purposes, we thought it was going to be a high scoring game. We thought we were going to see a lot of exciting things. But me and you were talking about this last week. These were two very good defenses coming into play, and they really showed out.
Well, yeah, and the first thing you said is Mother Nature had its own way. When you take the Super Bowl environment where it's a neutral state, especially at a game like in Arizona where they have a roof, the conditions aren't a factor, although a lot of players would tell you that the field wasn't the best in their Super Bowl. But, yeah, I mean, it was definitely a factor. There was a lot of storylines. You mentioned it. First of all, big brothers, they paved the way for you, little brothers. So we set the tone. We beat you so much that it's like ingrained in your head that you need to like work extra harder, which is what happened with Travis and Jason. And I showed before the podcast the very funny dodgeball meme with Jason and Travis where Jason says, Jody loves Chachi. And it was like, you know, it was hilarious. And you know what? Donna Kelsey was in attendance wearing her half Eagles, half Chiefs shirt. We saw a game actually between the Bears and the Lions where three sets of brothers were playing, and the St. Brown's parents were wearing half Bears, half Lions. So it was a good week for brothers going up against each other. But yeah, you know, I think we saw a much different game. I think the two teams are a lot different. You know, the Chiefs have a top 2, top 3 defense, in my opinion, and they played amazing. I mean, this is an Eagles offense that have coming in that has just been dominant. And if anything, their defense was the one that showed up. Both teams coming off a bye week. Usually it's Andy Reid who's got that extra little bit of, you know, trickery or leverage plans. But there's something going on with the Chiefs offense, and we'll talk about that in a second. But that's 3 straight games where they've been held to 0 points in the second half. I can't believe we're saying that about a Patrick Mahomes-led team with Andy Reid. Zach Wilson has more points in the second half than Patrick Mahomes in the last 3 games, and he's now the third-string quarterback for the Jets, which, again, we'll talk about a little bit later on. But I think this was not the best game of the week, but the most impressive win for the win of the week for the Eagles. Some people might say the Chiefs lost that game. I think it's supremely tough on a primetime game to go into Arrowhead, one of the toughest places, if not the toughest places to play in, Seth. Come away with a win, remain the top of the NFC with Detroit catching you, with Dallas on your tails. You know, this does a lot of things. We talked about in our 2-minute warning. Who is this more important for? And it seems like you were right with the Eagles. But was it the most impressive win, Seth? I think so, because I think there was so much built around this, and to get that revenge from the Super Bowl, which, again, they were a play here or there that they could have ended up beating Kansas City. I mean, Philadelphia won in all 3 phases yesterday, and they were also down 10 points at halftime. So the fact that they were able to come back and win in the trenches, in the conditions, at Arrowhead on Monday night, everyone's watching. Kelsey Swift. I mean, Taylor Swift wasn't in 10, Seth, but if you had the any game same touchdown parlay of Kelsey and DeAndre Swift, that would have hit. Both plays I thought that actually could have been called holding and could have been called back. But I think it was the most impressive win of the week. But a game that I think a lot of people expected a bit more points.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything you're saying. And, you know, when we previewed this game last week, I had made the point that, you know, the Eagles brought in specific players to win this type of game. And we saw that just work. It worked perfectly for them in terms of, like, DeAndre Swift looked great. Kevin Byard looked great. Jalen Carter looked great. Like, all of these guys that they have now cornerstone players on this team stepped up in their biggest game of the season. And it was a huge win. Jalen Hurts, obviously it resurfaced the virality of it when we saw the photo of his phone lock screen being him losing in the Super Bowl. So this was a game that really meant a lot to him, and it meant a lot to that organization, and it was very impressive. I do want to say on the Chiefs side, because look, you mentioned they're actually the lowest scoring second half team, and that is definitely a problem. But we were also one Marcus Valdes-Scantling catch away, a very catchable ball. Yes, it's a 50-yard, it's in the conditions. Like, I granted all of that, but it's perfectly placed. Patrick Mahomes could not have thrown it better, and we could be talking about a completely different story had that been caught and been a touchdown. But what I was most impressed by with the Chiefs, I think, because, one of our first episodes, I said I thought that the secondary in Kansas City was their weakest part of their defense. I'm now starting to think that L'Jarius Sneed and McDuffie are the best cornerback duos in the league. They were vicious out there. The hits that they were laying, they were reading these screens. McDuffie had 2 sacks. AJ Brown did not look like the normal AJ Brown we've seen all year. They had to rely on Devontae Smith. We saw Julio Jones have to get into the mix as a result. Obviously, this was also a Philadelphia team without Dallas Goedert, their safety blanket tight end. But yeah, I thought, defensively, it's always the most exciting games. We've got Hurts, Mahomes, we've got all these high power players, Kelsey, AJ Brown, all these guys. But defensively, it was a very fun game to watch because they were putting on a show.
I agree with you. And Dallas Goedert hadn't had a good season up to his injury against Dallas. Obviously, he's been out for a couple weeks. They had a bye week last week, but AJ Brown had 1 reception going into the fourth quarter. I mean, this is a guy who's been leading the league, that connection with Hurts and Brown. So I agree. I think we were talking about it, about their defense has really stepped up, in my opinion. It's with Chris Jones was a factor, top 2. I mean, we talked about some of the injuries they even have with Nick Bolton and him coming back. Like, that's a huge piece of their defense that's out, and yet they really controlled the game and the trenches for most of the part of that game. It wasn't until later in the second half where Jalen Hurts got his second rushing touchdown, actually the 11th game where he's had multi-game touchdowns, tying him with Cam Newton. So I thought that was a pretty interesting stat. But, you talked about the Marcus Valdes-Scantling thing, and I went on Twitter and I tweeted saying, had he caught that diving catch, it would have gone down as one of the catches of the year. But it shows up in the stat sheet as just another drop. And that's the problem with this Chiefs team. And it seems like, I know this is going to sound weird, but a guy like Juju Smith-Schuster, who, like, we look now in New England and is not really having a good year, had a couple good years in Pittsburgh, but he was that guy for Kansas City that's like the Tyler Lockett or the Keenan Allen. And what I'm saying when I'm describing those 2 players is not their talent level, because I think obviously we can all agree Keenan Allen is probably the best of all 3, is the fact that they're able to move the chains and be reliable in situations. Right now, Kansas City is trying to build that. I thought coming off a bye week there would have been some better ideas planned. I mean, they did run Isaiah Pacheco pretty well. They don't really have, like most teams, like a 2-headed running game. They have Jerick McKinnon, but he's either there in the block or most times just try and catch a ball.
Well, it seems like Rashee Rice has kind of been their guy.
Yeah, go on.
No, I was just going to chime in and just say I feel like Rashee Rice has had to step up and into that spot, but you're absolutely right. They are missing that, obviously Travis Kelce is the guy that, like, you expect him to always catch the ball, and he's the most reliable probably player in the league in terms of that.
Right.
But you need to have someone else for Mahomes, and Rashee Rice, I guess, has been the guy stepping up.
Well, yeah, I was going to say Rashee Rice has seemed like the guy, but Sky Moore, the Marquez Valdes-Scantlings, I mean, they don't have those complementary pieces that they used to have. And look, I'm not here doubting Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid. We did that last year when they lost Tyreek, and they ended up winning a Super Bowl. So the talent's still there, and they'll figure it out, and they'll be in the playoffs. But I had mentioned the 2-minute warning that this game could affect them in terms of where they get slotted in the conference. For them, it is important to play at home. Arrowhead, you saw how loud it was. I could hear it through my TV even at low volume, it felt like it was super loud. And so they've had something going, but there's a good chance this year that they may not have to, it may not go through Arrowhead, the AFC. You still have to go through Mahomes in facing them and getting past them. But this was a very defining situation where it's now been a bit of a stretch. It's not just been one game. We saw the one game where Kansas City played Denver. They barely won, but they got a huge performance from Kelsey. I think he had 10 receptions and 120 yards at halftime. And since then, defenses are like, let's just triple coverage or double coverage Travis Kelsey, and then let the guys around them and let Mahomes try and figure it out. We always see Mahomes with his legs, and we don't give him enough credit for his ability to get out of the pocket and then turn a play into nothing or gain 12 yards, stick out the ball and get that extra first down marker. But it's been more reliable that they are relying on that more and getting him out of those situations because they're unable to move the chains sometimes, and Kelsey is that guy, and who's the other guy stepping up? And they don't have that right now, and I think that's, concerning for the Chiefs. I mean, 0 points. I mean, they've got Harrison Butker with 50-plus yard field goals. They just need to get to like the 35, 40-yard line on the opposite side, and they're not being able to do it. The other thing that's been happening is a lot of false start penalties. Jawan Taylor, the guy they brought from Jacksonville after letting Orlando Brown go, he's been one of the most penalized linemen in the league. So that doesn't help. And then turnovers. They went punt, fumble. I mean, they were inside the red zone, and Travis Kelsey, who again, maybe he was thinking still about Taylor and Buenos Aires and how she wasn't there, but he fumbles. He drops a pass, a key first down pass on that final drive, fumbles the ball. So he makes a lot of mistakes that he hasn't made. Again, another pretty pedestrian day for him as well.
Look, I completely agree. I do think these are all correctable. I do think that, we are still talking about a Andy Reid led team, and I think regardless, the Chiefs, especially if they can secure home field advantage in the playoffs, are going to look different in the postseason. They always do. So yes, it's easy to kind of, talk about these blemishes, these mistakes right now, but they are still the best, dynasty in the league right now. And they've earned that. So we'll see what happens by the end of the year. But look, the Eagles now move to 9-1. They pretty much get some breathing room in terms of where they are in the NFC. Obviously, they haven't secured a bye week, but they are one step closer in getting that. And next week, they go up against another AFC matchup, another big AFC matchup, the Buffalo Bills, who came off their most impressive win of the season. So let's talk about the Bills for a second, because the Jets obviously have a lot to figure out. I mean, they've even just demoted Zach Wilson, you mentioned it earlier, to not only the backup, but he's the third string quarterback. It's gone that bad in New York. It seems like just New York and quarterbacks this whole season has been a shit show. But the Bills had to win this game and had to look impressive in that. And I feel like they did on both sides of the ball. What were some of your takeaways from this game?
Well, yeah, that was a great segue, Seth. I was going to say, we're going from an offense that had been struggling to an offense that hadn't been so struggling, but you expect more from both these offenses. And the Buffalo Bills set the tone right out of the gate. I mean, they on the opening kickoff, they cause a fumble. Trent Gilliam, the fullback who's had some nice plays this year and last year, comes in the special teams, makes a play, and it just set the tone for the rest of the game. And you could say, well, it's their most impressive one of the season. They blew out the Dolphins, but the Jets defense, and we've seen stats, and Sunday Night Football was throwing them the week prior against the Las Vegas Raiders, what they've done against some of these quarterbacks. And even though Gabe Davis didn't catch a reception, because I know someone had him on his fantasy team.
He didn't even get targeted.
But Kevin Shakir, a pretty interesting stat. Brock Purdy actually hit Brandon Ayuk for the longest touchdown reception of the year, 76 yards. And about an hour later, Josh Allen broke that record with the 81-yard catch and run by Kevin Shakir. So that was a little interesting feedback between those two. You're looking up if that's the longest reception of the year, touchdown reception?
No, his name's Khalil Shakir.
Khalil Shakir. Okay, thank you. I appreciate the name drop. But yeah, the Buffalo Bills went and played a really good game against a very stout Jets defense. So there's nothing to take away about there, even though Zach Wilson couldn't move the ball, which again doesn't help any defense. But Sauce Gardner was getting shredded. I mean, even though that Stephon Diggs and we mentioned Gabe Davis didn't have the big games, other guys have stepped up. And I think Buffalo really needed that win as well because their schedule is very tough coming up. You had mentioned that they'd go 5-2. We went through their final 7 games or now final 6 games, what that was going to look like. So they really needed that. And this is a week, obviously, that they had fired their offensive coordinator. So there was so much speculation, and it looked like Josh Allen got things a little bit going. Are they going to be able to continue that against an Eagles team in Philadelphia? That's going to be yet to see, but that was a very big step for Buffalo in terms of what they were able to do. And again, that AFC is still very, very tough. Very, very tough. They're not out of it, especially with the Joe Burrow news, which we'll talk about as well, about him being out for the rest of the year. This was a big game for Buffalo to get to where they want to be, which is in the playoffs again, obviously.
Yeah, and I was pretty confident last week that they were going to come in and really unload a lot of their frustration. And by all means, this has been a very frustrating season for both the Bills and the Jets. And I think you saw that at the end of the game in the tunnel when there was a huge brawl that kind of came out. And this game was feisty. It felt like a dogfight of grown men who've just been frustrated with how their season's been going. And, you know, the Bills obviously still, I don't think this game solves everything. I do think it's a step in the right direction. They've got a big game against the best team in the league I think it's in Philadelphia as well before your bye week. So if you win that game, you are then riding a high, but I still think having that bye week this late into the season might help them with a final push. But you mentioned that they fired their offensive coordinator, and another team just fired their offensive coordinator, also maybe built out of frustration with how their offense is playing. The Pittsburgh Steelers firing Canada, which is not Canada. It just seemed funny just saying being Canadian, firing the country. No, not Canada.
Canada, you're fired from being
affiliated with Pittsburgh. Yeah. Now, look, this was a game that was very winnable in Cleveland. Like, obviously it was going to hit the under of 20 points. or
23. So
yeah, 23 points. But, you know, they haven't been able to figure out anything in terms of momentum for that offense. I would say Jaylen Warren has looked very impressive this year, but we haven't really seen Kenny Pickett take a step in the right direction. George Pickens, we expect more from with the talent that he has, especially with Deontay Johnson. Like, these are 2 very good receivers, but it doesn't seem like they're able to really, you know, make these big plays consistently. And I guess it fell onto the decision-making of Matt Canada. And look, obviously Pittsburgh fans all year have been asking for this move to happen, but Pittsburgh doesn't typically fire their coaches. Sam, you mentioned a pretty interesting stat I thought you would share because I was fascinated by it.
It's the first firing of a head coach or a coordinator in Steelers history since 1941. And when that happened, it was, and I want to get the name correct, Bert Bell, the team's half owner, who fired himself. So this doesn't happen in Pittsburgh, but when you've been outgained in every single game you've played, despite the winning record, and it seemed like the black magic, the voodoo of Mike Tomlin when you're going against what's going to be Jake Browning, Doreen Thompson-Robinson, DTR, there's more of a thought process that this defense and getting 13, 14 points is enough to get the win. But they went up against, and we talked about the Chiefs maybe being the top 2 defense, probably in my opinion, the top defense in the league. And Myles Garrett, again, having a masterful performance. They've had issues in Pittsburgh. There was about a 20, 30-second montage of all the throws that Kenny Pickett threw over past the sticks. And it was 20, 30 seconds because there weren't many of them, and they were all incompletions. And there was a lot of plays. There was one, I think, 3rd and 11 play where they threw a bubble screen for a loss of 4 yards. I know you're limited, but you're in the NFL, and I'm always mind-boggled by the fact that there are these quarterbacks, because you look at their backup and it's Mitch Trubisky, a guy who's proven that he can win games in the NFL, but not a great quarterback. We talked about the 3 quarterbacks in New York that are in the pecking order right now, as you know, Aaron Rodgers potentially waits about coming back from an Achilles after 2-3 months, but there's guys out there. Cam Newton, I'm not saying still has it. Robert Griffin III was pleading to the Browns. The Browns signed Joe Flacco to the practice squad. I mean, he was out there. Josh Dobbs is showing what he could do. A guy that no one's really talking about, and obviously Colin Kaepernick, which I don't think anyone thinks is going to come back in the NFL, but he's been training. There's guys that are better quarterbacks out there, and yet we're seeing such an mediocrity, which I know Tom Brady had some thoughts on, as well, as he mentioned that on the Stephen A. Smith podcast. But you look at what's going on in Pittsburgh, and how can you say the product offensively is good? Yes, Jaylen Warren's been like the Tony Pollard of last year and been like the nice compliment. Literally, Ezekiel Elliott is Najee Harris, those goal line first down, and then Jaylen Warren's the guy who makes plays. He's now the starting running back. Well, that's why I took Jaylen Warren in fantasy. I knew that he was going to eventually take the role from Pittsburgh. It's not like Najee Harris was this great running back, but Allen Robinson has completely fallen off that. We thought when he went to LA that like he'd get rejuvenated, be around guys. We see what a guy like Puka Nacua could do there. So it's not like it's a question of this, but like he hasn't been able to do anything. Deontay Johnson has 1 touchdown in a year and a half plus. You know, George Pickens, you just talked about, he's been their best weapon, but Freiermuth's been banged up. You know, their O-line's questionable. And then, you know, Kenny Pickett, who I loved what I saw in preseason. There was all those stats of how he was perfect and no interceptions and everything like that. But is it so much to blame on Matt Canada? I think he's the scapegoat, similar to Buffalo. They have all the weapons and they still fire their offensive coordinator. But I also think that it goes to show that Pittsburgh doesn't have a lot of great weapons around Kenny Pickett. And Kenny Pickett probably as a quarterback is certainly limited in terms of what he can do.
Yeah, I mean, it's also hard when you think about that game in general. And obviously this was building, but Cleveland's defense is one of the best in the league. And I think that's an argument to be had in terms of who is the best defense in the league. But that's a tough matchup in Cleveland as well. You know, number 95 was dominant in that game. He continued his trajectory of winning Defensive Player of the Year. TJ Watt, though, also had a very strong game. Like, it was definitely, and I think everyone knew going into that game, it was a defensive, whichever defense was going to, you know, make that last stop was going to win the game. And it definitely kind of, you know, went that route. Obviously, the game-winning field goal for Cleveland was just like, you know, it was nice to see Dorian, DRT. I couldn't think of his name. DRT. Abbreviate. When in doubt, abbreviate.
DTR.
DTR.
KTR. Come on.
I should have known that. It was nice to see him getting emotional after the win. But yeah,
to that game-winning drive. So yeah, that's emotional. And they're going with him over PJ Walker because they know what they have in PJ Walker, and they're just saying Deshaun Watson's out long term. We want to see what we have with this rookie. We let Josh Dobbs go in. He was on our practice squad at the beginning of the season, right? So they obviously want to see what they have in this guy, and it seems like with the Browns that if they can get 17 to 18 points, they should be able to win most games and definitely be in all games. But Seth, I want to stick in that division. We talked about it in last week's podcast. There were 2 games inside that AFC North. The other one happened last Thursday. The Ravens beating the Bengals at home. But the big news, Joe Burrow, torn ligament in his throwing hand. He's done for the year. What does this do for the Bengals? How do they move forward? Because this is a guy who's had a couple significant injuries. There's a lot of comparisons to what Andrew Luck's been going through and why he retired at an early age. Obviously, we're not talking about Joe Burrow's retirement on this podcast, but another significant injury for Burrow. How does this affect the Bengals and him moving forward? And what does this do for the rest of the AFC North? Is it a 2-headed race between Baltimore and Cleveland now?
Yeah, this is definitely worrisome for the Bengals. And even just watching him trying to throw a ball on the sideline and just like the agony he was in.
Horrible feeling.
If any Bengals fan watching that is just like, we're fucked.
Any football fan.
For sure, but for when you're a Bengals fan and every season every time Joe Burrow's on the field, you have a chance of winning that game. And I just think, it's obviously heartbreaking when any, starting quarterback is done for the season, but I really think, I'm not sure what to make of Jake Browning. I don't know what his caliber of a player. I know we saw a bit of it, a sample size against Baltimore, but that's a hard environment in Baltimore. And now we'll have a full week and the weeks moving forward of being QB1 and working and getting those reps in with Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. And if you're a backup quarterback, we're talking about weapons. Like, we're talking about some of the best weapons in the entire league. So sometimes, you just got to throw the ball and hope that, Jamar Chase is open because he's 7'11". He's always open. And so they're not necessarily, you can't rule out a team with this roster. It is a huge blow. Of course it is. Like, this is Joe Burrow. Yes, he wasn't having the best season and he's had these slow starts, but he's still Joey B. He's still, comes up clutch when it matters. And I do think this will affect their playoff run. I personally, especially with the way the AFC is shaping, I think they've, losing your main guy, I would maybe remove them from what I would put as like a potential playoff candidate. We'll see how the season unfolds. But yeah,
this remove them, or you would officially remove them, because I have them off my list. I mean, I know Zach Taylor came out there.
How can you say official to anything? Like, if I were to make a bet, I'm not putting them in that bet, but, I'm not just going to write off the Bengals.
Okay, well, I am.
Well, then please elaborate.
Well, and I'll tell you, Zach Taylor came out and said, we're still going for it. But this is a team that's had issues with Joe Burrow. They were 5-5. It seems like this year they've been doomed from the start. With Joe Burrow's calf injury starting, they played him in the first few games and he wasn't ready. The last few weeks, you mentioned T. Higgins and Jamar Chase. Well, Jamar Chase has been battling a back injury for a couple of weeks. If that continues to get worse, they're not going to play him down the stretch and affect him and affect his future. T. Higgins has been out for the last few weeks. They obviously lost both their safeties in free agency. There was a lot of things that were going against this Bengals, but we saw a couple of glimpses of it in that San Fran game at home where they dominated against a team that maybe was on the reels, but had dominated in every facet. I believe that game was in Cincinnati. It might have been in San Fran.
Might have been.
You do a quick
Besides
check.
The point.
But this is unfortunate for the Bengals because this was the last year before Joey B, Joey Burr, Joey Ice, whatever nickname you want to call him, was going into his massive contract where they could pay everyone in those positions, right? So this is a huge loss for them. And look, we've seen crazy stories. Kurt Warner, underdog story, when he came in for Trent Green, and he led the Rams in his rookie year to winning the Super Bowl. Is Jake Browning Kurt Warner? Does he have an Isaac Bruce and Torrey Holt? I mean, you can make that comparison, and maybe he does show those things, right? Marshall Faulk, Joe Mixon. I don't really know if I would compare all three to those, but I'm saying they have the weapons, like you mentioned. I just think that that was at the beginning of the year, right? So they had the whole year. We're near the end of the season. They have some tough matchups coming up. I believe they actually go up against that Cleveland Browns defense this week. I'm just going to check. No, they've got the Steelers. But they do have the Browns again, which Joey Burrow hasn't been able to figure out the Browns. But yeah, the rest of their schedule is Steelers, Jaguars, Colts, Vikings, Steelers again, Chiefs, and Browns. So a lot of games inside the division. They're inside the conference. They've been 1-5 in the conference. The point is they put themselves behind the 8-ball with that slow start, that they don't have that little bit of brevity or breathing room to say we can lose a couple games. Jake Browning can learn and go through some growing pains and maybe win a couple games late into the season. They fall a few more games, and we talked about last week how close that AFC is. Every week there's a team moving up or a team moving down, and I just think there are better teams out there that are in a playoff spot or around the playoff spot. We talked about the Bills maybe stepping back up, and clearly they took a step in the right direction, that are in a better situation than the Bengals.
And the way the AFC is shaping in this wild card race, you lose 1 week, another team is right on the doorstep. And one of those teams who, has been making their way up. And one of our first episodes, we said maybe it was time to panic. And here they are winning 4 straight. The Denver Broncos. Russell Wilson is looking, I guess a lot of people are saying he's looking vintage Wilson, Sean Payton. Maybe they start to figure it out. But this Denver team who, there was talks of them selling at the trade deadline. They got rid of some players. All of a sudden, they're 5-5 at 500. And, their trajectory, you look at some of the people in the wild card right now, like Pittsburgh and stuff, like the trajectory of the Broncos is very favorable. And if you're a Denver fan, you're thinking, you know what? This is what we tried to get. This is what we were expecting all this time. And finally, we're seeing, Russell Wilson and the Denver Broncos win, and they're winning against good teams in good big games. So I don't take anything away from what I've seen from Denver. I just think it's very interesting, I guess, how the ebbs and flows of a season can go. Speaking of the Bengals fans have gone through those ebbs and flows all year since the moment Burrow got hurt in the preseason, right? So you never really can count someone out. And I think Denver Broncos are proof of that, being able to come back from a 1-5 record that genuinely people thought, oh, maybe it's time to look at Caleb Williams, look at getting a new quarterback, even though we went all in on Russell. And here he is starting to win games and string wins consistently. And it'll be interesting to see how that unfold as the rest of the season continues.
I don't know. You said it with like a question mark at the end, like you were curious. Like, we'll see how it goes. Yeah, the Denver Broncos have been a very interesting story. I mean, the Minnesota Vikings had the longest win streak in the league at 5, and now the Denver Broncos do. There's only one player outside of Cortland Sutton who's had more receiving touchdowns this year, and that's Tyreek Hill, who's the league leader with 9. Cortland Sutton's in second with 8 receiving touchdowns. And not only are they winning, they're winning in vintage wins with key plays by Russell Wilson. I mean, coming down and hitting Cortland Sutton. Last couple of weeks, making incredible catches. They also have the benefit of playing where there's no air, right? Like high altitude, and that really does affect teams. And, I think Josh Dobbs' parents were in the stands. I'm pretty sure at the Denver game, they were like, I wish my kid went to NASA and wasn't playing in the NFL and taking these huge hits. But, they're a tough defense. Even though they let them go, they actually just got a fine, a suspension. Kareem Jackson, 4 games for his hit on Josh Dobbs. So that's going to be interesting to monitor going forward. But this is the NFL, right? There's weeks where you look good. I mean, obviously, the big story for me this year has been the play of C.J. Stroud. I mean, he did throw 3 interceptions against the Arizona Cardinals, but another win for the Texans. They're now going up against the Jaguars with a chance to take a stranglehold in the division. They're only a game out, but they have the tiebreaker. And it's going to be in Houston as well. They won in Jacksonville that first time with the crazy kick return by the fullback or their third string tight end. So, I mean, the Jacksonville Jaguars, again, they're kind of, no one's really talking about them, but they're collecting wins. But CJ Stroud, again, Seth, does it.
Yeah, I mean, look, CJ Stroud, yes, he had those 3 interceptions, which, it happens. And, give credit for Arizona's defense, who all year has been competitive. And, what Gannon, head coach Jonathan Gannon has really tried to make that a big part of their identity. Kyler, his first game back against Atlanta, we saw some glimpses of vintage Kyler Murray. Not so much in that game. I thought there was a lot of missed opportunities that Arizona could have taken advantage and maybe won. But again, Houston's defense was able to be stout. But yeah, CJ Stroud, he threw for, I think, 339 yards. It just seems like every week he is proving time and time again that he is not just the best rookie quarterback, but one of the best quarterbacks in the AFC and in the league right now. So definitely an impressive season in terms of what we're seeing out of Houston. Definitely a huge game for that division. If Houston can win against Jacksonville, take the lead in that division, Indianapolis is right behind, and Indy's beat Houston. but they've lost to Jacksonville. Houston, is now has the opportunity to beat Jacksonville twice. So it'll be very interesting how that AFC South unfolds. Obviously, my hope is that Indy can find a way to play some postseason football. Because it's been a few years since I've seen that, but it's tough. The AFC is getting more challenging each week. And like I said, if you lose 1 week and you're in a wild card race, you're already at a significant loss in terms of where you're trying to get to. But we're talking about the season, how we're not, anything can happen, and that's just the way of the game. The Detroit Lions have come out of this game. You expect them to, dominate against the Chicago Bears, and yes, Justin Fields is back, but they look the worst they've been all season. Jared Goff, we're talking about throwing 3 interceptions. Jared Goff also throwing 3 interceptions in this game, and you're just watching it and you're thinking, where is this Lions, culture, this Lions identity that we're so used to? This, this team that's looked good all year, and then in the final 3 minutes, they're able to string consecutive successful drives and win this game and prove why they're the best team in their division without a doubt at this point. But very impressive win. You gotta love Dan Campbell, what he's been doing in Detroit, and they have a very exciting matchup, another divisional matchup this Thursday.
Yeah, and for the Detroit Lions and for both Jared Goff and CJ Stroud, I'll just say that the important thing that I took away from both the games is these guys are winners and they find games to win, similar to how Cody Fajardo did it for the Montreal Alouettes. Just a little.
Oh, you gotta love a Canadian reference. This is our second Canadian reference.
I might as well talk about the Canadian Football League. But that's all I'm going to say. But the whole thing is that they found ways to win, and the Lions may have been the most exciting game of the week as well for how it ended. And again, I have seen a lot of games end in weird ways with the offensive line kicking the ball out of the end zone. Prevent the touchdown might go down as one of my favorite. A classic Bears loss. I mean, Justin Fields, DJ Moore looked good, but this is a Detroit Lions team. Jameer Gibbs and David Montgomery. They've got I think we've talked about the best 2-pronged attack in the backfield. They've got both like prime Zeke, but I'm not saying David Montgomery's prime Zeke, but then they got Jameer Gibbs, who's like that Tony Pollard. Like they have both guys really stepping up, and then you have Jamison Williams really starting to make an impact. A touchdown for him with a big catch, but Jared Goff finding a way. You had mentioned earlier that the Eagles put a little bit more breathing room. I mean, yes, they're only a couple games over the Dallas Cowboys, but they're only a game up on the Lions. I mean, we could be talking about the Lions getting a home field bye. That is not out of the realm of possibilities. And in a year where Tommy DeVito's going out there and looking like vintage Peyton Manning, and Josh Dobbs leading Minnesota, and all these big quarterbacks that have gone out, and we'll talk about that maybe at another point, but there's been so many situations where, you look in the AFC and you got Deshaun Watson and Joe Burrow out, Aaron Rodgers is out, and the injuries have been such an epidemic in the NFL. It's all about staying healthy, right? And for the Detroit Lions, if they were to even sustain a key injury here or there, right, I think right now you can make the argument that the most important guy on that team is Amon-Ra St. Brown, because he is, talking about 7-Eleven, he seems to always be open. He's getting into the end zone. He makes some of the toughest catches I see. And, guy like Sam Laporta, who'd been really on fire for the last month or so, gets a little bit quiet in one game, but other guys are stepping up, and that's what you need as you head in towards the playoffs is complementary football. The one thing I will say about the Lions, and they should pretty much cruise to a win against the Packers. I don't think you can actually say the word cruise, so I take that back inside a division game on a short week. But I will say that the defense has been a problem. And Jordan Love looked the best he's looked all year with a couple late touchdowns in the second half against the Chargers. The Lions have given up a lot of points over the last handful of games. I mean, Justin Fields was balling out. He was not only running for first downs, but he was hitting DJ Moore for seam passes, and they were connecting for things. But this is a Lions team that gave up a lot of points to the Chargers the week before. They've given up a lot of points over the last month of football. How much can you say about the Lions and say this maybe in general about a defense that has the bend but don't break mentality, where they give up points, but knowing that their offense could put up enough points, that those key third downs where they can get a turnover. Jared Goff had 3 turnovers. You look at the stats in most NFL games, when a quarterback throws 3 turnovers, you shouldn't be able to win. We saw 2 quarterbacks, as we just talked about, C.J. Stroud and Jared Goff, who threw 3 interceptions, and both were able to still win the game against lesser opponents, but still, in the NFL, it's always tough to win.
Well, those are 2 teams that are just coached very well. I think that's really what it comes down to, is the fact that every player on both these teams' rosters can dig their heels when it gets to those points in the games. When your things aren't working, you still have that belief and that confidence in each other. Like, that's the one thing I love about football is, it's very easy to talk about the individual plays and these individual stats and CJ Stroud and all that, but you have to have a belief in all 11 guys on that field and all 53 men in your roster to be a championship team. And the Chiefs have shown it time and time again. It is not an individual sport. This is the ultimate team sport, in my opinion. And in the sense that, like, every player on the field has their own responsibilities. One person makes a mistake, it looks bad on everyone. So I think these teams really dig their heels. But, the Detroit Lions, what we've just seen all season, the excitement, and it just makes me, I was just thinking about it because we're obviously going into Thanksgiving this Thursday. And as Canadians, the thing that we love about American Thanksgiving is Thursday football. It is in our own 3 games. And every year it's always, you always see the same teams in Thanksgiving. You always get your Detroit, your Cowboys, and San Francisco. Those are kind of where the matchups are always built around for the most part. Let's say for the last 5 years, I would make that point. But Detroit is always the first game to start off Thanksgiving. It's always the Detroit Lions.
Correct.
Have you ever felt this excited about that? Like, that sentence being like Detroit Lions kicking off Thursday Thanksgiving football? Typically, you're just like, maybe it was Calvin Johnson. You're like, oh, it'd be great to see him get 200 yards or whatever. Yeah. But this is a legitimate team that you're just so excited to see because, they can beat you on the ground. They can beat you in the air. Amon-Ra can make an amazing play. Jahmyr Gibbs can make an amazing play. Like, they just have so many things going for them. Dan Campbell's so lovable as a head coach. So it's just great to see the Detroit Lions in terms of not only, it's just the winning culture and how that's reflective on, years of persistent, great management, front office decisions that have led to this. Great plays by everyone on their team. And now we have to kick off our Thursday Thanksgiving football, a Detroit Lions Green Bay Packers game where you're just excited to see what Detroit team's going to show up.
I couldn't agree more. I think the fact that we're talking about an 8-win Detroit Lions team opening up Thanksgiving football, I mean, usually it's an 8-loss team. I was excited for last year. They went up against the Buffalo Bills. It was actually the second time Buffalo played in Detroit. If you remember correctly, they had a game that was snowed out. They had to play a home game in Detroit.
Right.
So, that was, but we did get a good game with the Lions and the Bills. The Cowboys and the Lions, always the games that start us off. I will give you some of that. I remember a couple 49ers, I remember a couple Ravens, Steelers games as well. But yeah, there's 3 really good games this weekend. There are 3 divisional games as well. I want to do a quick betting segment, and we'll go back into the Thursday night football games, but I have 3 props, one from each game. Set they're over under, there's a player prop, and I want to get your thoughts, and I want to hear your explanation to if they'll hit or if they won't hit. So we're going to start with the Detroit Lions and the Green Bay Packers, and we've talked a lot about Amon-Ra St. Brown on this podcast. We're big fans of him. His receiving total for Thursday, a short week against a Green Bay team. Their defense, they held it together, even though Justin Herbert has been playing very well, or played very well in that game. But Amon-Ra St. Brown, over or under 85.5 receiving yards?
I'm going to go with the over. I think, we saw Keenan Allen hit over 100 yards in the game last week against Green Bay, and I think Amon-Ra St. Brown is gonna be eating well this Thanksgiving.
Okay. So Amon-Ra St. Brown, I will also take the over on that as well. My second one in the Dallas-Washington game, right? Washington coming off a game where they had 9 sacks of, as I've been calling him on this podcast, Danny DeVito. But Tommy DeVito, I got to say his name right this time. He balled out. He
earned
deserved
it.
He's earned the full name, Tommy DeVito. He screwed
The
my
Jersey Deuce.
he screwed my interception parlay. I didn't say why would you parlay interceptions, but I had
that's karma.
TR,
That's karma.
I had Aiden O'Connell, I had Bryce Young, and then Tommy DeVito couldn't throw an interception. Anyway, going back to the Cowboys and the Commanders, Dak Prescott, and again, maybe this will wager you if you think it's going to be a close game, over or under 265.5 passing yards in the game.
Ooh, 200.
Do you think it's going to be?
I'm going to hit the over on that.
So you're going the over. I also will take the over because I think that Dallas has shown me the last couple of weeks that they'd rather put the ball in Dak Prescott's hands. He's actually making more plays with his legs than he's normally done at a higher percentage too, especially getting first downs as well. But there were a couple drives where it felt like that Mike McDaniel clip where Mike McCarthy was saying to Schottenheimer, saying to everyone else, let's just throw the ball 9 times on this drive. I mean, Tony Pollard hasn't really looked like himself, but Dak Prescott's really taken it upon himself. And even if when they're up 27-10 probably in some point in this game, they're still going to throw the ball. They threw it to CeeDee Lamb when they're up 30 points just so he could hit a milestone last week of no, not last week, the week prior, for being the first time in NFL history to have 10 receptions and 150 plus yards. So I also agree. And the last one, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I feel like also Dak, he's been playing great all season. I think it's been a really good showing for Dak this season, but especially at home. Like he looks like a very different quarterback at home sometimes, where you're just like, oh my God, this guy could be if he just played home games all year, he'd be an MVP. That's kind of what it feels like. But yeah, tell me the last one.
Well, no, their 12-game win streak, longest in the NFL at home. Obviously, you got to win those games against Washington. We'll talk a little bit about those games a little bit more just after we get to this final one. But I do have a couple points I wanted to make, obviously, on my Cowboys. The last one, over or under rushing and receiving yards for Christian McCaffrey, 112.5. And those odds presented by Bet365.
You know, it seems very like, I mean, going through with the same pattern of the overs for that would make sense. I'm going to hit the under on it. I'm going to actually hit the under. I think that ball's going to be spread around in San Fran. They may potentially even get to a pretty comfortable lead if Geno Smith isn't playing, which it doesn't look like he is, but they're still figuring that out. So I'm surprising myself by even saying it, but I'm going to go over, under.
I actually agree with you on every one of them. I'm not trying to, for the sake of the argument, I'm not going to take it. This is not planned. Seth did not know which ones I said. I have 3 props, and I'm just going to let you know on air what you think. This game's in Lumen Field, Seattle. We talked about Arrowhead being one of the toughest places. It's a divisional matchups. I think that it's a short week. Seattle coming off a tough loss. I mean, the only thing that might sway it is the fact that is Drew Lock starting, is Geno Smith starting. He got banged up in that game, a game that, again, they should have won. Came down to a Jason Myers 55-yard field goal that he just narrowly missed. But it's in Seattle, and I just looked at the weather. Thursday, it's going to be 8 degrees. It's going to be chilly. There could be situations where, there's tough to catch a couple passes. And, we saw what Brandon Ayuk also did. He's really emerged this year as a huge target for Brock Purdy. I think Brock Purdy's going to be under a lot more pressure than he was against Tampa Bay. And I think the Seattle secondary and their linebacking core is right now in a better situation than what Tampa Bay was, which they showed case last week. But yeah, I agree with you. Over, under. We'll see how we do. Maybe we'll put a little wager on that and see what they pay out. But Seth, tell me, let's do just a quick dive into each game, kind of a quick snip analysis. Lions, Packers, both teams coming off home wins. What is your thought on, how big this game is for Green Bay? Because you're saying, Green Bay, they're 4-6, but there's some injuries in the NFC with Josh Dobbs, taking over for Kirk Cousins. We talked about now with Geno Smith might be out for Drew Lock. There is a small window where if Green Bay does get this win, they're only a game out of the wild card. And again, another tough place to play in Lambeau for sure, which a couple home games coming down the stretch as well. So how important is this game for Detroit, and how important is this game for Green Bay?
I mean, I guess. Oh, look, we've talked a lot about Detroit, so I feel like all the points I've made are pretty much already there. For Green Bay, though, looking at it on the other side of the coin, it's a huge game for them because you're trying to, obviously, any divisional game is important and you want to win those games, but to go into Detroit, to go into a rival stadium and to win a game on Thanksgiving against the best division or best team in your division, it tells everyone in that locker room, like, yeah, we can play with the best of them. Like, we can compete with these guys. So I would definitely say that is a very big statement for the Green Bay Packers, who have kind of looked like, I don't even know what to make of this Green Bay Packers team right now. I'm not entirely sure. Like, I do think Matt LaFleur is a smart coach. I don't know if he's a great head coach. I do think he's very smart, though. Jordan Love has shown glimpses, but he's also shown, the other side where he just hasn't looked great at all. So I'm not entirely sure. I do think they have a good young receiving core that is starting to get better. Romeo Doubs is looking pretty good. Jalen Reed is looking pretty good. Christian Watson hasn't looked great this year, but he's still very, I still think he's a talented player. So, yeah, I think that's my take on that game. But let's move on to the afternoon. Your Cowboys playing against Washington. Washington just came off one of the worst beats I've seen a team experience. We talked about Tommy DeVito, but just like Sam Howell, who's looked good all year, couldn't get anything against a pretty mediocre Giants defense that, in that game looked like they were the best in the league. But now they have to go up against one of the best in the league in that Dallas Cowboys defense. And, we were talking about bets. If I could take an anytime touchdown for Darren Bland, I would do that. I mean, the guy's
Ron Bland. Yes.
Ron Bland. Thank you.
Yeah, put some respect on this guy's name. 11 interceptions since last year.
Yeah.
Only 2 players have had 10 interceptions in NFL history in their first 2 seasons. Trevon Diggs and Deron Bland.
One thing about him is he's definitely not bland.
4th pick six, tying an NFL record. I mean, this guy. I mean, and I look at all the ones that he's done. Like the New England one, Mac Jones threw across his body. The one against the Giants was a weird one as well, but it hit off Trevon Diggs, and then he caught it and ran in. I mean, and especially as a Cowboys fan, there was such a, I don't want to say like the world's on fire, but such a like, are you kidding me? Trevon Diggs having this unbelievable season. Guy just got paid, he's balling out. He goes out, and Deron Bland is making plays on their top players. And Stephon Gilmore's doing his side, maybe a future Hall of Famer on the other side. He's doing his side. Cowboys know they can play, 4 or 5 guys going up against the quarterback because they trust the guys in the secondary to make plays. They say they've got really strong, even with Lane Vander Esch out for the year, guys like Donovan Wilson and Malik Hooker in the safety. So the cornerbacks have a lot of confidence that they just have to play their guy. And Deron Bland, I don't know. I mean, Trevon Diggs had that great ball security. He was a wide receiver turned cornerback, but Deron Bland has this amazing innate ability where if you saw on this interception, pick six against Bryce Young, is he caught it on a crossing route and then just bounced back up off the ground without getting touched and ran it in. I mean, he has this amazing awareness to make those plays. Look, Sam Howell, I'll give his kudos. He came in against the Cowboys in the final week, beat them. And they went with him. They added Bieniemy, obviously, to the coaching staff. He's had a nice impact as well. Brian Robinson's had a very good year. Sam Howell leads the league in passing yards, which I think if you took a look at his odds prior to the year of who would lead the league in passing yards, it's Mahomes, it's Allen, it's Herbert. It's not Sam Howell. But this is where I get a little worried for a Cowboys game. I mean, they've struggled in home Thanksgiving games. They won last year. Obviously, we talked about that 12-game home win streak record, but 10.5-point favorites haven't done that well this year, especially at home. And so Washington, it's a short week. Anything can happen. CeeDee Lamb was added to the injury report. He is expected to play, but he's been banged up with a knee injury. By the way, I just wanted to get this out because I had to do it while it was happening. If we put those over and unders in a parlay, it's plus 581 odds. So if anyone's out there listening and wants to do this, and we'll probably clip it and put it on social media, we're going to be doing it probably and seeing what happens there. But the final game, Seth, San Fran, Seattle, we talked about it a little bit. A lot of things going well for San Fran, 2 dominant wins Can they continue this trend? Do you think it continues? And more importantly, with Seattle, if Geno Smith is out, how does this affect them? Is it a big gap from them going to Geno Smith to Drew Lock?
We've talked all episode about backup quarterbacks. It seems like in just the pecking order of quarterbacks has been a common occurring conversation that we've had in weeks, it feels like. But I do think Drew Lock is in the better echelon of backup quarterbacks, but it is a pretty significant downgrade. And we even saw in last week, they took Geno Smith out precautionary, like they were up 16-7, so they take Geno out, trying to play it safe, try to be cautious, and then once they start losing and they're down 17-16, they need a game-winning drive. Like, all right, Geno, you're going back in, for him to actually get them into field goal range, and Jason Myers misses that field goal. So, Geno Smith is definitely their guy. And this team looks different. I think the plays, like they start doing a lot shorter passes with Drew Lock. You actually start seeing Noah Fant play more of a role with that chemistry. We don't see as many, of those deep throws to Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf. And Brock Purdy's playing great right now. Brock Purdy, we talked about it a few weeks ago, how there was a lot of hate, that was being directed towards him, and he wasn't looking like this, elite quarterback. And since we've talked about that, he's been playing very, very, honestly, just like near perfect football. I'm pretty sure he had a perfect QBR last week against Tampa Bay.
Perfect QBR, yep.
Yeah, so which I'm not saying Tampa Bay defense is like that's a, we saw a few weeks ago CJ Stroud break a record in terms of yards and threw 5 touchdowns. So obviously that's the kind of game you can have against this Tampa Bay defense. But still, you can't discredit what Brock Purdy's doing, how he's moving the ball. They're healthy. Deebo Samuel's back, which is huge for that offense. So, they did take a big loss in their safety. And I know I'm going to get the name wrong. I think it's Taulanga Hufanga.
Yes.
Hufanga. Thank you. I appreciate that. Names have been challenging for me this episode.
He's not a Key and Peele character. He's an actor.
But yeah, so I know that's a big loss, but I mean, Fred Warner to me is the best linebacker in the game. So like, I think he can definitely make up for that. But you know what? Thursday, Thanksgiving football, definitely have 3 games that feature a lot of very, explosive players, a lot of really exciting things that can happen. I think it's one of the most exciting Thanksgiving Thursdays in terms of the matchups, in terms of who's involved, that I've personally felt in a long time. And I feel like you share that same sentiment. And as we kind of get to this end of our episode, our 2-minute warning that we've started to do, you talk about the Washington Commanders and how they just had this terrible loss. And, there's been a lot of conversations on Ron Rivera on the hot seat. And that kind of brings up its own conversation in general on head coaches right now who are on the hot seat. So we are going to take this time, these 2 minutes, to express a coach that we believe is currently in the hot seat and why we think that they will actually be fired by the end of the season. And, I think I'll start off and then I'll pass it to you because for me, it's clear who is very much on the hot seat. You even saw him in his post-game press conference that he just seemed like he was losing the room. He seemed frustrated. He's losing it. And that's head coach of the Los Angeles Chargers, Brandon Staley. And look, this started last year in the playoffs when they had the worst blowout in playoff history. Like Jacksonville had the biggest comeback, and we've seen the videos of the guy who passed out and he woke up just to see his bet win because Jacksonville came back miraculously. And since then, it just has not been a strong belief that this guy is the head coach of this team. And when you have a guy like Justin Herbert, who he's one of the best quarterbacks, up and coming quarterbacks of the entire league, you want to see that progression. You want to make sure you're putting him in the best cases. And yes, this team's dealt with injuries, but what I saw in that game against Green Bay of missed catches, fumbles in the red zone, Quentin Johnson kind of looks like a bum of a first round pick right now. And it's obviously you never want bust of a first round pick.
Yeah.
However you want to put it, bum bust.
No,
he just hasn't looked like the type of player that they thought they were going to add to this arsenal of weapons. And we're now seeing a Chargers team who may not make the playoffs this year. And I actually was of the belief that they weren't going to make the playoffs. Like, I thought they were going to be one of those teams who was in the playoffs last year and wasn't going to make it this year. There's always turnover each year because I didn't feel confident in the culture built on this team. And now you lose Joey Bosa. And I think, we talked about scapegoats earlier, offensive coordinators. That's obviously maybe a factor into this decision and getting rid of Brandon Staley. But I just don't think he has been showing in any way that he's actually like built a culture, a sustainable culture to win. I think this is a team that relies on the back of Justin Herbert. And if he's not able to throw 4 touchdowns, 5 touchdowns even, because he's thrown 4 and still lost, they haven't been able to just build any type of momentum, any type of, sustainability. They've definitely taken a step back from where they were last year. And I think we're just starting to see the same cycles, the same patterns, and it does fall onto the head coach. The head coach builds that culture from day one. They set the minds, the mentality of every player. We've seen it obviously with Houston and Detroit. We talk about them a lot in terms of how the team builds and wins around that. And I just haven't seen that with Brandon Staley. And I just think like I mentioned in that press conference, he's kind of lost the room. And once you have a little bit of doubt or a little bit of an inkling that your head coach has lost the room, he has. Like, that's the reality. And I think that's very much the case with Brandon Staley and the Los Angeles Chargers. And I think he'll be fired at the end of the season when they don't make the playoffs.
Well, you texted me after that game against the Packers and said that Justin Herbert didn't lose the game. And, he said in the press conference that stop asking the questions if I'm going to give up my play calling duties. Another guy who could be on the hot chairs, Frank Reich's flip-flop, giving up his play calling duties and then took it back and then gave it back and then now took it back again. You can make the argument for Todd Bowles in Tampa Bay. He's the defensive coordinator. Sean McDermott. There's a lot of guys that you could say deserving on the hot seat. My pick is Matt Eberflus. I mean, you're talking about press conferences. This was the guy, not this past week, but the week prior, who said in the same press conference that Justin Fields was questionable, that he was doubtful, and he was out. Which one is it? And this is the team with the Bears that, a historic franchise. There's been a lot of great coaches that have come and gone in that league. I think this team always, in my opinion, regrets giving up on Lovie Smith. Took him to the Super Bowl with nothing. And Eberflus, nothing. I'm emphasizing because the Bears have been, Matt Nagy went through there. Like, there's just been a slew of head coaches that just have been so inadequate. And Matt Eberflus is just not the guy. And this is going to be a team with 2 top 5 picks at least going into next year. You want to get an offensive head coach. If it's Justin Fields, if it's Caleb Williams, if it's Drake May, you throw in DJ Moore and potentially Marvin Harrison. I mean, there are so many options, and again, with Staley, what I love about him early on is that he went for it on these 4th downs. Now it seems with Staley that you don't know, he'll go from 4th downs anywhere on the field. It doesn't matter what the down and distance is. And when he doesn't go for it on 4th down, you're surprised. Whereas Eberflus, also a defensive coordinator, but more of a defensive head coach in that he doesn't go for it on the 4th downs and relies on his defense. And they did add Montez Sweat, and he has played well since joining the team over the last few weeks. I do like the pieces around them. They do have some good pieces. Whether Justin Fields stays or goes, I thought he played fantastic this week. DJ Moore was great. That was a great trade for them, getting another top for a first-round pick and DJ Moore. And, Cole Kmet, they have nice pieces, but Eberflus, I mean, that room is so mixed up, and the way they lost that game to Detroit, there's no justifying why to keep him. And I guess for some of these coaches, and every year there's coaches that get fired. I think it's called Black Monday, right? It's the day after the season ends and all those coaches get released, but there was no reason to keep Eberflus. I mean, it's a lost season anyways. You might as well give someone else a chance. There was also a time this year where former Chicago Bear Peanut Tillman, who was informant for the FBI told information on a Chicago Bears coach, the defensive coordinator, I believe, and he was let go. I mean, there's been so much crazy stuff that's happened with
just
the
gotta
Bears.
blow up that whole.
Gotta blow it up. They have the picks. They have the cap space. They're adding some pieces. You got to get rid of Eberflus. There's a lot of choices that we could have picked for once, but I think Staley and Eberflus are the two best choices. And that's our 2-minute warning and another wrap on a podcast with some crazy games. Seth, hit us with your sign off.
Well, look, we talked a lot about how it's Thursday, Thanksgiving. For all our American viewers out there, we wish you and your family a happy Thanksgiving. There's also a game on Friday we didn't get the chance to talk about, but we got another divisional game on Friday as well.
Right.
So
Tim Boyle versus Tua Tagovailoa.
Yeah, who would have thought? Not me. But yeah, it's gonna be fun. A lot of exciting football to watch as we got Thursday, Friday, Sunday, Monday. It's a big. Those are 4 fun days for us and hopefully you as well. And we'll be talking about all of it and more next week.